watch it back. It will be sent to you afterwards. And Michael also has some resources that he will send on to you. We will have Michael talk to us first, and then we'll have a series, we'll have an opportunity for questions. So we hope to hear from you at the end, so we can engage in conversation on this important topic. So just give you a bit of background about Michael then. So Michael is director at Be The Change. So it's an organisation which does a huge amount of work with schools all over the world, in actual fact, and works with a lot of local educational authorities. And he works with them on a number of issues, too many for me to mention, but safeguarding, community cohesion, and obviously the topic that we're looking at today, a very important topic of diversity in history. And the other thing is, most importantly, we could argue that he's also a history teacher, so which is good for us. So on that note, I'll pass over to you, Michael. Off you go.
Well, thank you very much there, April. I hope everybody can hear me okay. You can see me, I can't see you, that's absolutely fine. I look a little bit flustered. I'm in London, of course, in the UK. It's thundering and lightning here, and it's very humid, and we don't have any air conditioning. Not that I expect you to feel sorry for me. That explains why my face is a little bit red because of the heat, but I'm not going to complain about that. So I'm here to talk to you about diversity and diversity teaching through history. And as April said, I'm a history teacher myself. I've been involved in a range of things over the years, both in terms of curriculum, planning, working with groups of teachers in different schools, and working across sort of local areas on things related to what we call community cohesion. And one aspect of that is, of course, well, how do you deliver that through the curriculum? How do you allow people that have very different backgrounds and different experiences to hear each other, to recognize some of the common threads they have, and also to accept and recognize that they have differences in the way they see the world based on a whole range of factors. And that's actually related to our role as history teachers, isn't it? Because what is history teaching? I mean, firstly, of course, it's the teaching of the past. It's the experiences of people within the past. And we could sit and talk for hours about our particular opinions on that. My personal one is that the past helps us to understand the present. So if we watch the news, or we read the papers, or we read it online, we know what's going on in the world. We know about, the bombing of Palestine recently by the Israelis. I know that could be a contentious subject. And that's the thing, isn't it? So when we sort of locate the present and we look at people's viewpoints and how they react to things that happen, of course, the clues to that are in the past, and that's what we teach. It's been a very unusual couple of years. There's been a lot of things going on, as we all know, not least the COVID-19 pandemic. But also, of course, the events in the USA seem to have reverberated around the world, with the Black Lives Matter movement as one example. I don't know if you keep up to date with what's going on in the UK. Groups of university students protesting first at statues of figures that are responsible for key parts of the slave trade. Lots and lots of hot potatoes in terms of opinions. And that's another thing about the purpose of history teaching, surely. Many of the things we teach, even though they're in the past, some of them are so related to the present that they're quite controversial topics. And I suppose one of the questions I would ask you to consider when you're thinking about what you teach is, how controversial might be some of the topics that you teach in the past, in terms of how they're related to the present. And you may live and work in countries where, there are prevalent agendas. But whose story is it anyway? I don't know about you, but when I first became really interested in history at secondary school, I got taught the same things at secondary school that you probably deliver today. And for me, I was very much into social history, because I could see, certainly in 19th century and 20th century British history particularly, I could see things I knew about my family. So particularly my grandparents were alive, and they would come from mining families in Wales. And I grew up in Yorkshire in a big sort of mining area, and it was the 1980s, and there was a lot of things going on, the miners' strike, and lots of other things. Anyway, the point being that it actually created more interest for me because I could connect it to myself, and I could see something about me and my identity. I could live on the stories of not only my grandparents, my grandfather, for example, and his many years down the mines and his involvement in sort of social movements, but also from my grandmother and her experiences of the war and of the 1930s and even earlier. And that's one of the things that really made me interested in history. And I guess we've all got our own story to tell. But then, okay, so whose story are we telling? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by diversity. And again, it's open for debate. And I will ask you if you want to contribute when I ask you to consider some questions, to use the chat facility to do so. And hopefully April will also help me out because now that I'm sharing my screen, I can't actually see the chat facility, but she can. And she may read some of those out for me. If you look at the pictures on the screen, yeah, it's interesting to note that the picture of women is in colour, and it's not as far back in the past as the other ones, which were all related to a theme. So it's also interesting that Google accounts for 86% of searches around the world. But when you search for certain things, the kinds of things that you find in terms of not just content, but also imagery that support you to deliver things can be quite limiting. And so if you type in anything about, I was looking at things like the role of Arab women in World War One. And of course, I didn't find very much. Of course, I can delve deeper. So one of the things that we'll also think about today is I'm going to share with you some possible perspectives and steps that you can use to start to think about how diverse your curriculum teaching is, what opportunities are there to build in things about the experiences of people from diverse backgrounds. So on that note, um, in terms of my own teaching, it's mainly been in the London schools. And obviously, as you know, London's a multicultural city, but there are many multicultural cities around the world. In fact, the country itself is pretty multicultural these days. So in my typical classrooms, when I was teaching history, I would have, for the sake of argument, native British children. Some of those were white, some of those were Pakistani heritage, some of those were African heritage, some of them were first generation, some of them were third generation. I had quite a number of children that had come from as first generation from different parts of the world, Asia, the Americas, all of the continents you can think of, as well as, of course, um, European. So let me ask you, and maybe if you want to contribute through the chat, think about some of the classes that you teach. I don't know your schools. I know you're in lots of different places across the Middle East. So while I do know some areas, I'm not going to make an assumption. What is the makeup of your classes, the classes that you teach history to? And I don't know, April, if you could, if anybody does contribute on the chat room, if you're able just to sort of say it out loud, that'd be great.
Yeah, I will do. Yeah, so I've got a comment from Heather saying almost all Egyptian.
Okay, brilliant.
And James Walker says mostly Emirati in his school.
Okay, well, I'm guessing that also gives me some clues about where you work, which is absolutely fine. And that's good. Okay, so let me move on and ask you this question. If you think about the pupils that you teach history to, um, on the screen, you'll see there's a few questions, and I'd like you to sort of think about some of those questions for a few minutes. And I'd like you to give us some feedback if you're happy to through the chat. Some of the things I'm interested in is, thinking about the needs of your pupils, whether it's Egypt or in the Emirates, what's the greatest influence on your pupil's sense of identity? Do you know? What about their view of the world? And where did they get the view from? And if they thought about diversity as a word, what would they understand by it? And do they have any particularly negative thoughts about it from your experience? And do they hold what you might consider to be misconceptions about diversity based on where they live or their own sort of backgrounds? And what, in terms of what you deliver in terms of a history curriculum, what do you do to value the identity of the different pupils in your school? When they receive history, how much of it can they relate to? And is it better for some pupils than for others? So there's a lot of questions for reflection. Just to let you know, I've shared with April, and she'll be sharing on with the video of the webinar a resource that covers these questions, critical questions you can ask yourself to think about reviewing your teaching and think about opportunities to build in different aspects. So don't worry about writing them down or anything now. Anybody want to give me any comments about any of those questions? I mean, particularly the one about influence on their sense of identity. Have you got any ideas?
I have a lengthy response here from Jason. So thank you. The most delicate topic we have to deal with is probably the Holocaust. I would agree. However, a sense of change in outlook since the improvement in diplomatic relations between Israel and the UAE. So some positive aspects of that.
Thank you. It's interesting though, isn't it? I mean, you know, we know about the Arab Spring, for example, or some might argue the failure of the Arab Spring. I mean, what I'm interested as well is, you know, thinking about the children in front of you. When you teach what you teach, how much they feel it relates to them, and are there opportunities, even if we teach the same kinds of things, to build some of those things in? So those are some questions for reflection. We're going to come back and think about those in a little while. I'll just check my timings. So, you know, what do we mean by diversity in terms of whose story is it anyway? I mean, the programme of study in England for Key Stage 3 includes the teaching of cultural, ethnic and religious diversity. And sometimes people think diversity is about race, and of course race is one of the visible factors that might influence it, but it's not the only thing, is it? And, you know, it covers gender, of course, it covers religion, and it covers majorities and minorities. And so, you know, I started thinking about the teaching that I received, which I was quite interested in, you know, and the slant of history when I was at school, particularly, you know, whose history are we learning? And I think that's something we can consider. And what opportunities are there to talk about the experiences of, for example, women through some of the momentous periods that we're talking about? And what about minorities, whether it's you know, ethnic or religious minorities, as well as thinking about the experiences of the majorities? And so class plays a part, of course. Linguistic factors can play a part, social factors. Migration and emigration is a part of diversity, because actually, certainly when we talk about British history here, we're talking about the movement of peoples. If you look at any period that you teach, the events of that period may cause people to emigrate or to migrate, and there may be movements of peoples in the areas that you're talking about. And you know, the influx of peoples into countries or areas and their experiences being relatively new or being very established, that's as old as history itself. And so that's one of the things. But on top of that as well, it can be social, economic, and technological aspects of history. You know, for some of you in the places that you live, you know, what were they like 40 years ago, 50 years ago? And, you know, in terms of children making sense of their place, not just about where they live, but in the bigger picture of, you know, how history relates to them, to generate interest and curiosity. And of course, another aspect of diversity is different interpretations of history. So which interpretation, and while we all know as history students that we look at different interpretations of history, we argued about interpretations of history at university, but in terms of delivery, Key Stage 3, for example, Key Stage 4, GCSE. You know, I don't know which syllabuses you particularly use. I know April uses IGCSE. You know, are the different interpretations of some of the big events reflected in what we teach? The two pictures relate to the partition of the Arab countries in the aftermath of the First World War. You know, which perspectives do we hear about? And that's just, you know, a small and narrow aspect, but different interpretations of history. Um, how do we see it? And how does it relate to the children that we teach? So, you know, that's something that we all have an opportunity to do. So this is an example of one of the syllabuses. This is the IGCSE. I picked it because April told me that happens to be the one that she her school does, and it's kind of interesting. I would strongly suggest that those topics are pretty similar to the topics I learned when I was at school, apart from maybe between 1970 to the year 2000. And of course, you've got depth studies as well. Sometimes the syllabuses that we teach can actually be quite dry, but then of course we have opportunities to build in new aspects. Maybe it's easier to do that lower down the school. But in a sense, what you're trying to help children do, aren't you, is to place themselves and locate themselves within the big picture of the history that we're trying to teach. So inside these topics that we may have to teach, there are also opportunities, whether it's through first-hand accounts and other aspects to explore the experiences of different types of people that may typically be overlooked in a sort of, let's call it for the sake of argument, a more traditional teaching of history. So, okay, that might be the what and the why, but then the question is the how, isn't it, really? And I guess there are lots of different perspectives on that. In the document that I've prepared for you, I've copied and pasted and put together a whole range of links to resources that can get you going. Many of those are from History Today or from Historical Association, and there are many more available. It does, you know, it takes a bit of work and a bit of research, and some of the things that you might want to look at, for example, the role of women in things like the Middle East, for example, it's pretty hard to find, but there are dedicated collections and things where you can find information about those things. Um, just takes a bit of digging. So let's think a little bit then about the how. So here's a suggested approach, um, and we'll go through those and then we'll see what you think about those. So I suppose the first thing to consider, if you look at the table on the screen, is that actually you all, in some way, shape, or form, already teach things that relate to diversity. Um, and one of the things that you can do by looking at aspects of diversity, as I talked about earlier, and thinking about the topics that you currently teach, whatever age range, I think about what you currently do, in your opinion, that actually incorporates and addresses explicitly diversity, in your curriculum. And of course, where there are gaps, if you so choose, because it's not like it prescriptive that you have to do absolutely everything, there may be opportunities to broaden that out or to look at things that typically haven't been taught there. And I would say, thinking about those questions on the first table, connected to your pupils. So, just out of curiosity, when you look at that table broken down by aspects of diversity that you could teach, and some of the sort of years or periods that you teach, and some of the lessons that you teach, anybody prepared to share through the chat some of the things that they do where they think, yeah, actually, this is stuff we currently and already do, which we believe addresses diversity in the context of the history curriculum? Anybody brave enough?
Maybe they're typing at the moment.
Yeah.
we teach Native Americans in year 8. So there's one example. Don't know if anybody wants to add onto that. So we've got another one, political diversity. We're looking at difference between capitalism and communism. That's
Okay.
Yeah, so we get political diversity.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about our depth study in Russia. We look at the the social differences, the differences in society. So we look at the diversity of that aspect as well. I guess lower down the school, there's an element of we do cover Industrial Revolution, although not in any great depth, but that brings about certain technological aspects. And then we've got another comment from Jason. Feel we encompass them all, but always mindful of religious aspects. Yes, religious aspects, diversity. That's a hot topic in this region.
I know there's a lot of hot topics in your region.
Yeah. Heather's saying civil rights. Yes, civil rights in America. Yeah, that's obviously a big.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because some of the topics you've mentioned, I mean, those are topics that we've studied and we've taught. And I suppose, sorry, I know somebody else has posted a comment.
Don't know if you say ethnic diversity, looking at the impact of Indian soldiers during the First World War.
Yeah, so one of the pictures that I showed on the screen earlier on was related to that. And again, it's thinking about, for example, the experiences of minorities. So, whether you're looking at Russia, communist Russia, or whatever, what were the experiences of certain groups of people that we typically wouldn't talk about and experience, and how could we deliver that, and what does that help us to understand about the way that either Russia was governed or how Russia changed, for example. I mean, there's lots and lots of opportunities to shine the torch on different things, and I suppose one of the things that some people who are cautious about this say, well, it's a bit tokenistic. But then if all history is valuable and the experience of all people are valuable, what can the experiences of minorities compared to majorities tell us a bit about either what was similar about their experiences or what was markedly different? So one of the links, I think, on the resources that you'll receive are about blacks in Tudor England. And so what was that? There were quite a few black people. I won't say the word lots, but there were quite a few black people in Tudor England. I wonder what their experience was. Now, again, going that far back, you've got to really delve deep to find some first-hand accounts and experiences. I mean, I'm sure they do exist, but certainly in more recent history, there's a plethora of information. And so, in a sense, you could, with your colleagues, use something like this table, thinking about what do we currently already do, and if there's I don't know, or if there are gaps, how could we extend that, and how could we extend that within the framework of the things that we're required to deliver? So then the second stage is the table I showed you before, connecting that to the needs of your pupils, because if, as I am aware, some schools have had complaints, if you want to call it that, or views expressed by pupils. Why are we learning the history that we're learning? How does this relate to me? More and more people, whether it's at school or university, are speaking out. They're speaking out about what they're learning, and they've got a valid viewpoint, which it's a viewpoint. But in a sense, one of the things we've got to do is we've got to be clear about that. So if we don't know the answers to the questions that are currently on the screen, maybe we can ask some of our pupils. I mean, it's hard to ask them what misconceptions do you have about diversity, but you can definitely ask what they, about their sense of identity, and what's their view of the world, and where do they get their view from, or what stories do they get told? Where do they get their history from? How do they understand their history? Just to be interested and curious. And it may be that some of you have had lots of conversations like that, but in a sense, connecting it clearly to your pupils, to the needs of your pupils. So, for example, in England, the movement of peoples is a big opportunity, because As I said, particularly, I work in London schools, and I know that there are children from, all walks of life coming into the classroom. And I would say historically, to excuse the pun, we haven't really talked to children about identity sufficiently, because it's one of the big topics that you hear teenagers talking about. And actually, history is the perfect place, isn't it, to think about identity and to think about why people's moved at different times to, let's say, in my case, I'm talking about specifically the British Isles, and it's also important to think about some of the agendas that might lead to, sort of more racist viewpoints or extreme viewpoints, in terms of recognizing that this isn't new, that some of the agendas that are being played out through social media and the press, the increase of far right activity, to be blunt, in the United Kingdom, when you locate it within its historical context, that actually the contributions of different groups across the years, multiple opportunities to talk about those. But also, I think the thing that again connected me to what's in social history, what their lived experience was, and how that's changed over time, and how much they were, that was factored into the sort of the big thinking about the history of the time. So connecting it to your pupils and your students is really, I think, quite important in terms of reviewing the opportunities. And then, as I mentioned, certainly from a perspective about British history, but it doesn't have to be about British history. Thinking about the movement and settlement of peoples across time, and what opportunities that there might be to do that. And this may look like an aside. I was doing child protection training yesterday, which I also do around the country for people in schools and other institutions, for people that lead on child protection across the in their organisations. And I had a senior paediatrician from a hospital in London on my course, and she was a black woman of Nigerian descent, born in Nigeria, came over here, and she was talking about her experience, the increase of abuse that you get in hospitals, including for the senior doctors. And she was explaining that every single day people look for the doctor when they come into the room, because all they can see is a black woman sitting in the corner, and they don't assume that surely she can't be a doctor. That's absolutely her lived experience on a daily basis. And because her surname sort of sounds slightly Indian but isn't, she said that people come looking for the Indian doctor. And again, it's interesting about people's conceptions, stereotypes, and sort of prejudices. And she said that's just her daily experience. And again, I'm talking about a current situation, but you wonder, don't you, going back through history, what the experiences, for example, of females are, or females of different ethnicity at different times, and how much that's reflected. Because one of the questions on the checklist that you'll see from the document that I've sent you is, when you're teaching your children history, are they aware that 50% of all history involves women? That makes sense. Or maybe I rephrase that, but 50% of the population of the world is pretty much women. And how much is women's history reflected in the kind of things we learn? So, if we ask the children that we teach that are female, or we ask our daughters what their experience is, how much do they see themselves through what we teach? Because if they don't see themselves and they can't connect to what we're talking about, then history becomes quite a narrow, and I would suggest dead experience. And one of our jobs in thinking about this particular table at stage 3 is, what opportunities exist through what we teach to inspire and excite pupils to be interested in history as a subject, to see its relevance to the modern world and the lives they're going to live. And, that takes it way beyond tokenism, and recognizes sort of not just the multiculturalism, but also the sort of globalization of the world that we're currently in. This globalization as a concept may be quite new, but actually the movement of people across the world. April mentioned talking about Native Americans in year 8, and some of the pictures I shared with you early on in the my webinar were pictures taken from historical archives of the United States, the experiences of Arab communities when they first arrived, 100 years ago in the US. And so those archives exist. There's lots and lots of opportunities to explicitly make a connection with your pupils. And so, yes, just checking my timings because I said I'd talk for half an hour and then take any questions. And by my reckoning, I've talked for half an hour and I'm going to take some questions. There is a lot more that we could talk about diversity. If you start to explore the resources and links that I've shared in my document that you'll receive with the recording, of course, you can do an in-depth study on this. My purpose really is to give you some tools to help you to go back and to critically evaluate opportunities that there may be for you to incorporate it into your teaching and maybe, dare I say, to think a little bit outside the box. But I suppose for me, as a school leader, my biggest consideration is, how well do we know our children and what are our children saying about our subject, just about what interests them, but how much can they see themselves connected and related, in this case, to the past through our teaching of history? And if they can't, does that make history then just uh, uh, a narrow subject that's only accessible to a few? How can we broaden out the appeal of history? Because I'm sure all of us here are in agreement about one thing: history is an incredible subject, and it's about as broad as you can get. And really, most of the people I know in important positions in around education all did history degrees, I might say, even though everybody talks about STEM. In fact, it's history that seems to be the common denominator. Um, so really, it's an important question, isn't it? Because it's not just about being tokenistic. It's about thinking about how do we actually inspire both boys and girls from a range of different backgrounds to recognize themselves within what we teach. And on that note, I'll stop. So if anybody's got any questions or comments they'd like to add related to the topic or anything they'd like to moot so that anybody else can contribute an opinion on chat, I'm going to give you some time to do that now. We've got a comment. Have we got a comment?
Not just yet. I'll tell you what, I'll ask to begin with, and then it just gives people a bit of time. I think sometimes with when you're looking at your curriculum for any purpose and you're thinking you want to bring in a change. So I'm already thinking, there's a lot that we're not doing, if you see what I mean. How would you recommend starting? Would you try and just deal with one aspect at a time, or do you think it's a case of posing the questions first of all within the department? What do you think would be the best way to tackle it so that it seems more manageable and not so overwhelming? Because sometimes the overwhelming nature of things like that can kind of be an off-putting thing.
I mean, I did actually manage to get the chat up, so I can say thank you to
Oh
both
yeah,
and Jason for your comments. I mean, I'll give my opinion on that question you've asked me, April, in a second. I mean, Jason Plummer's already asked about any recommendations on resources for local case studies. That's a really interesting point. Um, I mean, you can start with a document that I've sent you because, like I was doing, it leads me to other information, and there are lots and lots of archives and collections in the hands of private collectors who are, um, you know, um, who are offering that free to the public. And so, I wonder, in wherever you work and teach, there will be probably a whole rich uh, origin of historical resource somewhere. If you live and work in Cairo, for example, if you live and work in Dubai or wherever it is that you work, in terms of local case studies, in my experience, they're easy to find in the local area, but it might involve a little bit of asking around and look at maybe some of the, um, it could be rich individuals that are collectors. I remember once a few years ago, we asked a professor, Professor Gilali, to come from, I can't remember where he lived in the Middle East. He came to talk about his book, 1001 Muslim Inventions. That was the book at the time. Fantastic resource that he'd created. A very erudite man, and really, really impressive. And he actually gave a book. It was a very big tome. It must have cost close to £100. He gave a book to everybody that attended the conferences we put on from his own pockets. And I suppose that's interesting, isn't it? Because people that are interested in their local history will collect a whole range of historical information which may be useful. And I think you might start with local newspapers. There's certainly online resource for that in the UK these days. I wonder if there are in the places that you work, but it could be with going to a museum and asking that question, or something like that. I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's the only one I can think of. In terms of how to get started, I mean, yes, James, you've mentioned in your comment, haven't you, about trying not to make it almost like just a one-off topic. It's tricky. So depending on who you're reading about, who's giving their opinion about diversity in history, I mean, I've read different authors that have said things like we should be looking to. So, for example, if you take, let's say, the history of black peoples, may of course, where do we normally start? We normally start with Africa and the slave trade. So it starts off almost as a sort of a negative deficit, but they would talk about, needing to sort of go a bit further back and look at sort of African civilizations that did amazing things before the sort of the white Europeans came along and made people into slaves. There's also examples of kingdoms in Africa that refused to engage in the slave trade on moral grounds. And it's interesting. So they're talking about trying to have a perspective whether you can see positives and negatives, but you're talking about going back a little bit further than we typically go back to in history. The three tables that I've shared with you are around this idea of creating a unit of work on the movement of peoples across an area during a period of time. And of course, when you look at the periods given here, you can think, well, that's way too long. And of course it is. But, like when I think about the Middle East, for example, whether it's a hot topic or contentious, of course, I'm interested in, the First World War. I'm interested in how the Arab world got involved in fighting on the side of the eventual winners, and who actually decided to carve up the Arab world in the way that they did, and what the impact was in terms of maybe you know Arab interpretations of that agreement, how they were betrayed and things like that. And I think there's an opportunity to do that, but also that period in the post World War era, there was a lot of movement, wasn't there, across the Arab world of different peoples. There were also sadly genocides. What I'm trying to say is there's lots and lots of rich topics. You might shine a torch on a particular moment in time, or you might pick a few moments in time with the idea of helping your pupils to kind of see a kind of continuum to where we are today. I don't know if that makes sense, but it reminds me of a history trip that we used to take our children on to Germany. We stepped to Berlin, and we actually started from the end of the First World War all the way through to the wall coming down in 1989. Or was it 1990? I was there at the time, so and we actually did moments in history that involved going to, the concentration camp, for example, all the things that you might think about, but we were actually trying to help people to understand the continuum. How did we end up where we are today? And provided lots of resource, and it was very rich. So it might be thinking about a unit of work, and maybe it's done at Key Stage 3 that kind of sets a theme and connects children that they may understand what they study at GCSE more because they've had that opportunity. You've got more freedom maybe lower down the school to do that. I don't know if that helps. That's what I would recommend, thinking about a unit of work rather than just sort of one-off particular lessons. And again, I suppose the only other thing I can think of, and I'm going to ask people to jump in, sources. So of course, GCSE and beyond, we regularly are asked to look at sources and evaluate them critically, understanding the skills of history to think about those things. Well, sources can come from a whole range of different areas, can't they? And so there's opportunities there to think about. what, people's experiences, and what does it tell us? What information or clues does it give us about the time? What else might we need to know? And things like that. I mean, those are great opportunities for generating interest, and leading on to even more personalized study, because you can allow students to go off and explore some of those topics on their own and maybe present back to you. So it doesn't all have to be delivered by you in one particular way. That's one of the great benefits of the internet, isn't it, these days, for example, in terms of research opportunities. And who knows what your pupils will come back with. Um, that's a possibility. Anybody got any suggestions in answer to James's statement that, every time he tries to add more diversity, it becomes very much just a one-off topic and is not covered in any depth. So I don't feel I'm doing the topic justice. Any advice that you would give from your own experience?
I think actually, Michael, that it's just a really good reminder of that tackling it in themes is a really good approach. I think in my previous school we had a similar theme of migration and settlement, and then we also had one of empire and decolonization. And I feel like that's something I've forgotten, and it's just a really good reminder of having that thread that you keep coming back to. And as important as anything, also developing understanding of those concepts that then they take forward. I think so. It's a really good reminder for me to think in those terms. I think it's a really good approach to plan over time, and something that you can engage with the whole department about.
Yeah. And I'm sure people have got some very interesting ideas. I think, unless we give each other permission to talk about it using some of these frames or to shine a torch on it, we don't give people a chance maybe to contribute ideas. And sometimes when we feel we're lacking in ideas, it's actually our colleagues that can help us with that.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's an opportunity. And I think, wherever you work, I say, and I went to Cairo a couple of years ago, and if you're going to say, of the cities around the world that are historically rich, I mean, well, all of them are in their own way because that's the nature of history. But there must be reams of stuff in Cairo. It doesn't have to go all the way back to um, the ancient Egyptians, does it? So in terms of modern history and locating where we are today and understanding why people move, think, and why they protest and why they pull down statues, because that's happening in the UK. And people are asking the question, well, why are they pulling down these statues? And that's an introduction, but that's also been happening in other countries, hasn't it? And it's not about just today. You know, when they defeated Saddam Hussein, they pulled down these statues and a range of other ones. And the point I'm trying to make is it's a starting point to kind of ask questions, and sometimes it's the questions that pupils can ask themselves about history and then go off and explore what the answers might be, which um, uh, lead you down the line rather than you as the teacher having to kind of not just ask the question but also deliver the answer. Um, and I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it as well. Um, you might be interested in Sugatra Mitra. He won the first £1 million TED Talk. You're probably aware of him. Schools in the Cloud, and he's got a fantastic resource for asking big questions of your pupils and allowing them to work in groups in very unstructured ways to research topics and present back to the rest of the class. And you can use that model too, and see what comes back. So I think that's a key thing for me, not having to have all the answers all the time, giving pupils and students the opportunity to maybe research things based on big questions. I don't know what you think about that. I think we're done now, are we, April, in terms of time? But hopefully, just some of those questions have given you a chance to think. This is not something you can sort of just look at and then just go away and forget about. I mean, there is a checklist of questions that I've shared with you, that will be shared with you by April, and I think hopefully you can use those with your colleagues, with the departments, just to think creatively and find opportunities based on the things that we've discussed briefly this morning.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. That's been really enlightening just to get us, and thought provoking. I think more than anything, it's asking those questions. And I think my brain's wearing away already. I think it's something I'm going to go straight to the department with in view of for next year, seeing what we can change. So hopefully, I'm sure everybody else has also felt that. So thank you very much for your time and also for the resources. And as Michael said, the recording will come to you probably on Sunday or Monday. It takes a bit of time to chop things down. So they'll come to you early next week along with the resources. So thank you ever so much for everyone attending. We've had a thank you in the chat there as well, Michael, from people in the group. So thank you and lovely to see you. Okay.
And enjoy your long hot summers.
Thank you. Yeah, I think most of us try and escape, but thanks anyway.
Yeah, indeed. Okay.
I don't know if Julia's still in the